Earlier, I spoke to Steven Pifer, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine from 1998 to 2000. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution here in Washington, D.C. I began by asking him how Russia's absence affects the dynamics of the G7 meeting.
Well, the G7 leaders meeting in Brussels, one focus of the conversation, perhaps the focus of the conversation, is how do you deal with Russia in these new circumstances where the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin have shown a readiness to tear up the rule book that has governed post-war Europe and use military force to take territory from a smaller neighbor. And so my guess is you're going to see discussion, coordination, what should the Western approach be, perhaps some discussion about what steps might trigger further sanctions to increase the penalties on Russia with the objective of trying to effect a change in Russia's policy towards Ukraine.
How about the support of Ukraine's kind of devastated economy? Is there much they can do there?
Well, there actually is a pretty good economic program in place. The International Monetary Fund has agreed to provide Ukraine up to $17 billion over the next 2 years. But the key thing will be is that Ukraine continue to make the economic reforms that are in the IMF program, because of course that money flow is conditioned on those reforms.
What should we be looking for in terms of the West providing a united front? Should we look for any cracks?
There is strong unity between the United States and Europe within the G7 on this question. The cracks begin to appear when you begin to talk about some of the particulars. So, for example, my impression is that the United States would like to move in concert with Europe and the European Union on more robust sanctions, but in Europe there tends to be a more cautious approach to the sanctions. Now, in part, that's understandable. Europe has 10 times the trade with Russia that the United States does, but that shouldn't totally cloud the fact that unless there are penalties and consequences for Russian action, we may have to worry that the Russians may repeat these actions again in some place that's much closer to home.
What about energy security?
There's sort of a mutual deterrence relationship, to use an old arms control phrase from the Cold War, between Europe and Russia, is that Europe is dependent on Russia for about 30% of the natural gas that it uses, but Gazprom, the Russian energy giant, is usually dependent on Europe as the main source of its revenues. So both countries want to keep that relationship going. The kicker is that about 50% of the gas that transits to Western Europe passes through Ukraine. And so to some extent that relationship becomes hostage to these negotiations that are going on now between Ukraine and Russia on what price Russia will charge Ukraine for natural gas.
Putin is not at this summit, as you know. It's the G7, and yet he's going to be meeting with Prime Minister Cameron, Angela Merkel, and Hollande and in the near future. What do you expect is going to come of those meetings?
I think the Russian president is going to be very, very sensitive to, does he hear difference in nuanced, different approaches between Western leaders, and if he sees cracks, he'll try to exploit them. So it really will be very important. To the extent that Mr. Putin is going to be at Normandy, and there's a reason for that. The Russians, as well as the Ukrainians, bore a lot of the casualties of World War II. But it's also going to be important that it's handled in a way that doesn't somehow detract from the fact that there is a bit of isolation of Russia going on, that there's a G7 today, not a G8 meeting in Sochi. And it will be very important that Western leaders who see Putin for private meetings convey a similar message.
Stephen, one final question. Are we likely to see them break new ground on the economic front? This really is about economics in a sense, and yet it seems like Russia seems to be the main focus.
There might be some talk about the possible trade deals, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and then the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But it seems to me that given the extent and the nature and the depth of the crisis between Ukraine and Russia right now, that's going to command the bulk of the attention for the G7.